This video is about Al Purdy's poem At the Quinte Hotel. It's a fairly famous Canadian poem, and the reason why I've included this on the course and the selection of texts for today is partly to get us to think about the voice of the speaker in the poem. Okay, that as we approach literature, specifically poetry, but not exclusively poetry, is that sometimes people like to conflate, that is, compress the author and the speaker together as if they are the same person. And a lot of the texts that we'll be reading play around with this idea that we're not just, authors are not just the same person as their texts. And it's a very popular thing to want to do. So Purdy here is playing with this idea of the sensitive man, for I am a sensitive man, right? So here he is as a poet, as a writer of poetry. You know, how many people run around calling themselves poets? Certainly some people do, but not a lot. If you meet a poet, what kind of stereotype do you have of a poet in your head? And so he's taking this idea of the sensitive poet figure and toying with it. So he walks into this bar, this underground bar, as he says, with underground sunlight. So it's lit by fluorescent bulbs or whatever you have. So he's not out in the sunny day of, the August sun in the romantic tradition of nature poetry. No, he's in Ontario in a scummy bar, underground with no windows and artificial light. And so this should get us thinking about the conditions of poetry, the place of poetry, the time of poetry. Is this a place and time for poetry? And he's asking questions of this poet figure that we imagine walking into this dingy underground bar, and he says that he sees people reading comic books. So what's the relationship of a comic book, a text, to the poem? Okay, and he's trying to bring everything down a peg. Purdy did this a lot in his writing. He was seen as a kind of everyday Canadian poet, a kind of working class person who's worked a bunch of crappy jobs, yet he still writes poetry. So we don't really picture poets necessarily toiling at menial, laborious jobs of digging ditches. It's something other than that. But Purdy, of course, is trying to get us away from that to think about poetry and say, look, these people are reading comic books. Is this a place for poetry? So he gets into a bar fight and he starts talking to people. Did you know I write poems? What kind of poems? Okay, and so he tries to bring poetry to this place. And so this is one of the things that I want you to think about in this course about the origins or the emergence of Canadian literature as a national body of literature. How did poetry come to Canada? How do we write a distinctly Canadian poetry, if at all? And what does that look like? What does it include? And so for Purdy, it includes underground bars and fights and comic books and the stuff that seems to be decidedly not poetic material. And so we see him trying to use traditional poetic images of the beer that's yellow, and he says that the beer has yellow flowers in it. But then he says it's half fart and half horse piss, that fart and piss are not necessarily poetic words. You wouldn't hear Wordsworth using it, although you might hear Shakespeare using it. And then when he beats the guy up and he drags him into the bathroom, there's red flowers on the tile. And so in the bleeding, beat up body of this man, he sees beauty. He sees red flowers, but it's really just blood on the floor. And so we see Purdy trying to translate his environment, his experience into poetry. But the stuff of a scummy underground Ontario bar is not the stuff of poetry. And so it's a struggle for him to try and articulate this. And this was part of writing Canada. And so at the end of the poem, he's telling his poem, and he says, and it was a heartwarming moment for literature. And then he says, a poem ought to be worth some beer. And that's always been one of my favorite lines in poetry, because he ends off by saying, and poetry won't buy beer or flowers or a goddamn thing. So that raises the question for us as readers is, what is the value of poetry, or in this poem specifically, what is the exchange value of poetry? What's it worth to you, a poem? Is it worth nothing? Is it worth just itself? Can we exchange poems for anything? Do they have any value? And so he's asking us to think about the place of literature, both geographical place, where do we write poetry, and also the cultural place, that what is the appropriate time to think about poetry.